What happens when a young woman from Brooklyn takes a job in Moscow during the Great Depression? Sana Krasikov will tell us about her debut novel, The Patriots.
She's not a blind ideologue. She doesn't go to Russia because she's politically brainwashed. I think she goes to some degree because she's kind of a proto-feminist.
How did Arthur Conan Doyle unleash the greatest literary detective of all time? Michael Sims will tell us about his new book, Arthur and Sherlock.
Sherlock Holmes had a kind of three-dimensional air about him, even though he was heroic and larger than life.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Sana Krasikov joins us now to talk about her novel, The Patriots. Sana, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
All right, this is a debut novel. You've written a collection of short stories. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book. How long have you been working on it?
From beginning to end, probably a little over 7 years. I actually started thinking about it before I finished the first book. And when I was still completing the first book, I had been vacationing in Cape Cod with a good family friend who we'd known for many years. And he was, I thought, a Russian immigrant, like my parents, like me. And I was surprised to learn that his parents were actually both Americans. And they had left the United States separately in the 1930s, traveled to Moscow, met there, fell in love, and then disappeared, as so many people started to do. He ended up growing up in orphanages and didn't meet his mother again until he was about 13 or 14. And the story of this woman who made this reverse immigration fascinated me so much because it was just so different from my own experience of coming to the United States and embracing the American dream. What kind of circumstances would make somebody make that choice? So the book became The Patriots is a story about 3 generations of one family moving back and forth between the United States and Russia. And it begins with the life of this woman, Florence Fine, who grows up in a nice middle-class home and decides at the height of the Great Depression to travel to Moscow, and then what consequences that decision has for her son and then his own son later.
So it's a kind of reverse emigre novel in a way, but then it goes back and forth. It reminded me in that sense a little bit of Brooklyn, Colm Toibin, and it's
wonderful book,
back and forth. Does this summer guest know that his family was the inspiration for the book?
He did, and he really was very encouraging of the project. In fact, he was able to get his mother's dossiers, which had been declassified in Moscow. It was such a treasure to be able to get your hands on things like that, and he shared them with me. The impulse for the book actually came from starting to read them, seeing the picture of his mother, whose name was Pauline, on the 5th or 6th page, and she'd been a beautiful woman, tall, and had these beautiful blue eyes, but in the mugshot, you could see this loss of hope and this face staring kind of into this permanent elsewhere. And it felt so real to me. It felt like I had such an obligation to the people that inspired the book and the history that they lived through. It kind of, I think her spirit was sort of a guiding spirit as I wrote the whole book.
Let's start at the beginning with the first generation. There's Florence and then her son Julian and then his son Lenny. Who is Florence and where do you start her in Brooklyn?
So Florence is a young, idealistic, impulsive, bright young woman. She's not a blind ideologue. She doesn't go to Russia because she's politically brainwashed. I think she goes to some degree because she's kind of a proto-feminist. All of the things that I think we're seeing today during a prolonged period of economic crisis, the class tension, the racial anxiety, the gender divides, the populist rhetoric, all of those things were also happening in the 30s. I think she wants to be part of an equal opportunity world. She wants to skip over all of this mess and go straight into the future. And Moscow at this time is like the shining beacon. It's like the Paris of the 30s. And she wants to go to a place where women's labor is valued. And the other point is that she falls in love with a Russian engineer. And
before she gets there, or when she's there?
Before she gets there.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just the job offer.
Right, because of work, because of love, because of politics, she ends up making this choice.
And this is 1933.
Yeah, 1933 to 1934. Just like today, we had all of these headlines about the Red Menace, but on the back end, there was an enormous amount of business being done with the Bolsheviks. They were industrializing, so they were buying up American technology, American steel, American know-how. I mean, that's how they got all of this, that they were able to build the Soviet Union with. So they were sending these groups of engineers here to learn all this stuff, to buy up this machinery, and she falls for one of them, and he sort of sells her on the idea, and she follows him to Russia.
And all is not what she thought it would be when she gets there.
I think by the time she realizes that her idea of the place doesn't match up to what's really happening, it's too late and she's trapped. And America doesn't want her back. The door kind of backwards is closed off. And I know some people who've read it mention that that's a very claustrophobic moment in the story where she loses her American passport.
I don't want to have you reveal all of the plot twists and everything for listeners who have not yet read the book, but were you aiming to have this kind of multi-generation sweeping story, historical romance in a lot of ways too, and mother-son story? Did you have it's a very ambitious sweep. Did you know that's what the book was going to be when you started it? Did you set out to do that?
I wanted the story to be about our time as much as it was about that time and be able to see the echoes of both periods. I started writing it in 2008 when the world sort of went into this worldwide economic recession. So as I was immersed in the history of the 30s, I started to see a lot of the social trends that we're seeing now. Well, Julian was also just psychologically a really interesting character to me.
Julian is Florence's son.
Florence's son. And I mean, the first scene of the book is that he meets his mother again for the first time. Well, he's about 12 or 13, and he's 12 in the book. And
so what year is this?
So this is 56. So Stalin's been dead for 3 years, and they've started to release the prisoners. And they can't release them all at once. So they're releasing them bits and pieces. And the first thing he notices is that she has this thick American accent, which he, in his child's memory, has like edited out. And it's so shocking to him. And part of it is that he's American on the inside and Russian on the outside, which is the opposite of a lot of immigrants' experiences. And he loves his mother, but their relationship is always fraught. And politically, he just is a very different creature. I mean, the first thing he does when he comes to the United States is vote for Ronald Reagan. And I wanted to write a kind of character who was an intelligent, erudite, 60-year-old Russian Republican man.
Why?
I've heard those voices in my head for years. They're the voices of so many men I know, and I haven't seen that in fiction, and I wanted to give that character the respect of his reasons.
What's the origin behind that character, that type of person that you know?
Well, I mean, the book is called The Patriots, and I realized that to some degree I was writing about two different conceptions of patriotism in one family. You know, Florence is this progressive definition of patriotism, all about holding America to its promises of equality. That's why she leaves. She doesn't feel like those promises are being met. And Julian's is much more prosaic than that. It's really a more conservative definition where the central value is freedom, not equality, because he's from a place where everyone's equally miserable. Part of me wanted to show that both definitions are valid. I think one often gets more press than the other, but I was interested in that divide because as an immigrant, that's a divide that I live with myself.
You're also, and now I'm going to do a little bit of generalizing, part of what seems like this new wave of Russian Jewish immigrant fiction writers. Do you?
Yeah,
Do you feel like you're part of it? Do you know these other writers?
I do. I was in a panel last night with some of them. I think they were really a terrific bunch of writers.
Who was on the panel?
Lara Vapner, Boris Fishman, Irina Rain, and I think they're doing all very different iterations of that experience.
And there's Gary Steingart, of course.
Right. We're all very different from one another.
When did you immigrate to this country?
I came in 1987 when I was 8 years old.
Do you feel like it's influenced you in terms of your own perspective of what patriotism is?
Yes, but I don't make any pretense about being a Soviet person. I do feel like I'm squarely an American, having come at a fairly young age. But those voices are in your head, and to some degree you're a medium who can channel them, and that's the contribution you can make. But the character of Lenny, I definitely resonated with a lot. And this is Florence's grandson who, like me, grows up in the United States, but returns to Russia during kind of its heyday of the wild east of capitalism.
In 2008?
He goes earlier. He goes in the end of the 90s and has this ambition to have $1 million in the bank, and of course is eventually eclipsed by the homegrown talent who's kind of leapfrogged him. And I think living as an expat in Moscow and then elsewhere, that experience of feeling like life is moving very fast, but there's this like a collegiate flavor of it being on hold as well, that you can do everything, but then when it's time for you to come home, you're afraid to come home, and you're afraid to come home a failure. That was a story that I feel like was very close to me, writing Lenny's story. I think in that way he can understand his grandmother in the way that his father couldn't, because she too leaves home, and then when it's time for her to come back to the United States, she can't do it. She almost can't even say the word America. That was one of the stories that our friend Timothy had told me that really stuck with me when I started writing this book, that when it was time for him to emigrate in 1979.
This is the friend who started off
who started off the story. His mother, he said, to leave meant to be gone. You weren't going to come back. It wasn't like now. She refused to go with them, and she refused to say the word America. And she would just say, "Oh, are you still going to that place? That place?" And I thought it was such a weird detail, that cognitive block, that I thought, well, what has to happen to some idealistic young woman over 50 years that she cannot even say the name of the country where she was brought up? I think as fiction writers, you're always leaning into that weird detail that doesn't fit, and that was it for me. Like, is she afraid to come home a failure? She was a difficult character for me to understand at the beginning of the book, but I think the process of writing it, she really made a case for herself.
Is this at heart, in your mind, a mother-son story?
Yeah, it is a mother-son story. I think it's a story of generations, and the way we misunderstand each other, the way that we try to find a common language across cultures, across eras, the labor it takes to make that effort sometimes.
And yet there's a lot of specificity of time and place in the novel. You have Moscow in the 1930s. You have the whole Cold War era. You have the financial crisis, and you deal with oil corruption.
Yeah.
Did you have to do a lot of research?
I did. But I was lucky because I had great people to tell me a lot of inside information. Julian eventually, when he comes to the United States, ends up becoming an executive for an oil company that's doing drilling in the Russian Arctic. And we're also seeing a lot of that in the news now.
This is the Russian Republican character.
Yeah.
That brings me to a final question, which is, you couldn't have known, having begun this novel 7 years ago, that it would come out at a time when all of these issues, when Russia is so in the news. I mean, do you think that the novel in certain ways, it does sound like it touches on a lot of this.
History does repeat itself, but it repeats itself with you as part of the story the second time around. It's not surprising to me that 8 years after we had a world financial crisis, Donald Trump was elected. A lot of the things people are finding puzzling about our relationship to Russia, that on one hand it seems to be undermining us, and on the other hand we seem to be cozying up to it, that's happened before as well. One of the great heroes of the 20th century, FDR, had kind of a bromance with one of the great villains, Stalin. There was a mutual admiration there as well, and to some degree was strategic because they had a common foe, which was fascism, the way we have terrorism. But to another degree, they were both strong leaders who, and FDR believed in a strong executive branch and believed in bringing a nation up and getting things done and having to break a few eggs to do it, and also cleared the State Department of people who had good intelligence on Russia and installed somebody, Joseph Davis, who was basically, his job was to look the other way from all of these abuses of Stalin's.
Is this a political novel?
No, I don't think it's a political novel. There's a lot of politics in it. And there's a lot of the texture of this weird dialectic dance between Russia and America that's been going on for the past 80 years. But I have no political axe to grind. That goes counter to my, I feel like my job as a fiction writer.
All right. Well, it sounds like it is a historically political novel, and for a historical novel, also quite timely in its way. The book, again, is called The Patriots. It's a debut novel by Sana Krasikov. Sana, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela.
This is Greg Coles. I'm an editor at the Book Review, and I'm joined now by Alexandra Alter to talk about publishing news. You've got George Orwell on your mind.
I do, and so do a lot of other people, it seems like. There's been a massive surge in sales for Orwell's classic novel, 1984, which is about a dystopian society where critical thought is suppressed by totalitarian leaders. And there has been a surge.
I wonder why.
Well, this is a good question. The sales surge started this month, and it sort of has been picking up steadily as we approach the inauguration, and it hit the top of Amazon's bestseller list recently. And the publisher of the novel, of the paperback, which is Penguin, is ordering 75,000 new copies because they're running out of.
Wow. Can you define surge? Do you know how it's doing percentage-wise and numbers-wise?
Yes. According to Craig Burke at Penguin, the book has hit a 9,500% increase in sales.
Wow, 9,500%.
Yes.
Wow.
And what's interesting, I mean, there's a lot of probable reasons why this book is on people's mind, but I think a lot of the interest in this book at the moment has to do with concern about false news, alternative facts, which was a phrase that Kellyanne Conway, who's an advisor to President Donald Trump, she uttered that phrase on an interview on Meet the Press.
And not a phrase, of course, that appears in 1984, but Newspeak and Doublethink both do, and it's maybe a similar idea.
Exactly. Those are phrases that are in 1984, and it sort of encompasses the same idea of creating an alternative reality where facts are up for debate.
It's not just an attempt to control the narrative, but to control the very nature of reality, of what the facts are, what is real. Huh.
Yeah. And you've seen a rise in sales for other kind of classic dystopian novels. Another book that has picked up in sales is It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis.
Sure.
Which is, of course,
Imagining the rise of fascism in America.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was written during the Great Depression when the country was sort of ignoring the rise of Hitler, but it's a satire, and of course it centers on this kind of populist leader who taps into all this kind of distrust and resentment, but really is a fascist kind of dressed up as a populist. So that book is now in the top 10 at Amazon as well. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley has risen to number 9. So these are all kind of classic novels up in the top 10 that we haven't, seen sort of selling this well for a while.
Do you happen to know if there's been any spike in sales for Philip Roth's alternate history, The Plot Against America, which also imagined, kind of set at the same time as the Sinclair Lewis. It imagined if Charles Lindbergh had won the presidency and collaborated with the Nazis and didn't get into the war. That's a book that when it came out received a lot of comparisons with It Can't Happen Here. It's kind of looking at it happening here.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I think that book has been discussed as well, and it is still selling well. It's number 6 in alternate history on Amazon's bestseller list.
Okay.
So I think that's something that people are turning to as well.
And more dystopian fiction doing well?
Another one that's up in the top 100, it's number 23, is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood.
Feminist dystopia.
It's feminist dystopia, exactly.
And there's a TV adaptation of that book on the way, too. So
there is. I think that's also generating interest in this book. And this is a novel that has always been a bestseller and something that people have turned to. But the combination of, I think, anxiety about women's rights plus the TV adaptation is really generating interest in it.
And another book with a recent TV adaptation that I think is also seeing a spike in sales is The Man in the High Castle, the Philip K. Dick
Yes.
dystopian Nazi-based.
Right. That's an alternate history where the Nazis won and we're all living under that sort of regime. So that has an adaptation that's, I think, doing very well on Amazon, and the novel is selling well, too.
Yeah. What's interesting about all this to me, of course, dystopian fiction always does well. I follow the bestseller lists pretty closely, and especially in the young adult bestseller lists, there's always kind of the Hunger Games and Divergent.
Veronica Roth.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. All of these things. That it's a popular subject, but it's interesting to see the classics making a comeback, to see people kind of turning and looking at where the genre sprang from.
I agree. I mean, it's been a popular kind of area for the last 5 or 10 years with all kinds, Emily St. John Mandel's novel. There's always sort of new ones coming up, even Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
Right.
There's plenty of new dystopian fiction coming out, but it is surprising when you see this massive spike for books that were written decades ago, kind of looking forward and imagining some, a horrible authoritarian future, and people are looking back to see what authors envisioned many years ago.
Yeah, just looking to see who was prescient maybe and who wasn't, what still holds up.
Right, and I wonder if, people, a lot of these books are assigned in school, and so it could be that people have some foundational knowledge of them but want to reread them now and see how they resonate differently.
Right. They have a glimmer of memory of having read it in high school or middle school, and they want to revisit it now in light of the current environment.
Possibly.
Alexandra, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Michael Sims joins us now from Pennsylvania. His latest book is called Arthur and Sherlock, Conan Doyle and the Creation of Holmes. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So you have written a number of books about literature and several about crime, including a Sherlockian pastiche, The Memoirs of Silver Blaze, which was in an anthology in the company of Sherlock Holmes. It's interesting because you turn to very often subjects that are not new in general. Charlotte's Web, Henry David Thoreau, and now Arthur Conan Doyle. What draws you to these subjects that are obviously, these are not the first books on these topics?
Yes, people do ask me that, and it's in part I think that it's books, authors, characters that I have loved for a long time, and I've begun to think I see very clearly a way to tell the story that no one else has done, or even at times a story that no one else has ever opened up and sort of unpacked in the way that I want to do it.
What did you want to unpack in this new book, Arthur and Sherlock?
One of the most interesting things about Sherlock Holmes is that he is the first modern superhero. And so I wanted to tell this, the notion of this creation of a character who would become so iconic well before he was known, not look ahead, stay in the time, and tell it very much as a story. And it's because there are plenty of full-length biographies of Conan Doyle. But if you're writing a biography, you can't pause and linger. You can't open up or flesh out a scene. You don't have time for much texture or atmosphere. There's a lot of ground to cover. And I have that time. I wanted to zoom in on just the inspiration for and creation of Holmes, and that meant I could tell it my way with a lot of novelistic atmosphere.
But again, a challenge because there are so many dedicated Sherlockians who, know a lot of this territory well. But did you feel like what was the story that you felt like had not been told?
I hadn't seen it all pieced together as just a story.
Right.
It's like a post-mortem the way literary criticism works, in that you're looking at this and you're looking behind it with an annotated note or whatever, and you're piecing things together. And I wanted to take, 140 years of that and keep it backstage out of the way of the story and just tell it from the beginning. and beginning with Dr. Joseph Bell, the medical professor that he had in Edinburgh when he was very young, and how his sort of hero worship of that turned Bell in his mind into almost a semi-fictional character who fit in very well with the quirky, eccentric detectives, fictional detectives, that Arthur was already reading about.
So it's not a biography of Conan Doyle, but nonetheless, you do have to start with his life. Tell us a little bit about Arthur Conan Doyle, the man.
Part of the fun of writing about Doyle is that there's so much atmosphere and color and Dickensian detail in his childhood in Edinburgh. He was born of Irish parents but grew up in Scotland. And he went to boarding schools. He fought with the kids on the street. They didn't have much money, but the family had a lot of artistic accomplishments in their history. And Edinburgh was a town that was very much in love with learning. There was a 200-foot-tall monument to Sir Walter Scott, who was one of the fabled sons of the town. And so from the very first, you see an excitement in learning, an excitement in history, and a great sense of language in Conan Doyle, even from his earliest childhood. So that's a lot of fun to go in and explore that and try to recreate it.
And he goes into medicine, but also is writing at the same time. Did he want to be a doctor, or did he truly always want to write novels?
He definitely was pursuing medicine. That was his plan. He wasn't like Charles Darwin or someone who headed in that direction and went, oh, God, no, I can't take this. Mm-hmm. So he did get a medical degree, but he was starting to write short stories and send them out in what he called the circular tour, because he felt that they would bounce back almost before he had sent them, as writers feel even today. He was doing stories and had written a fairly feeble little first novel and hadn't achieved very much. He had slowly gotten some recognition from editors, and then he had the idea of turning his mentor in college and his hero in his mind, Joseph Bell, into a fictional character as a detective.
All right, let's hear a little bit more about this diagnostic genius, Joseph Bell.
Dr. Bell was legendary in Edinburgh at the time, and he was part of a movement that's interesting. I hadn't seen much about this in other Sherlockian things even, that Bell was not unique. Beginning around the turn of the 19th century, detailed, careful, specific diagnostic analysis as they brought patients in became very important. They had few technical tools, very little in the way of equipment that would help them diagnose anything, and so they had to learn to read thick skin, mottled skin, pinpricks on the fingers very often would mean that person was a tailor. So you'd be diagnosing what they called stigma, the visible evidence of occupational labor. And this was a time when working men and women would wear almost uniform-like clothes, denoting their class and often their profession at a glance. And so all of these factors played into the way that other people besides Arthur Conan Doyle would call Dr. Bell a superman and a magician and terms like that, because he seemed to have this kind of supernatural insight into people merely because he had an eagle eye for details.
How did Arthur Conan Doyle, age 26, as you said, he's written a couple of things, short stories that didn't go really anywhere, 2 unpublished novels at the time, take Dr. Bell as an inspiration and get to this character of Sherlock Holmes?
He took the very strong, powerful mental images of Dr. Bell striding confidently through the patients and diagnosing everything right and left, and he mixed that, not consciously or deliberately at first, but in a creative cooking pot in his mind, mixed in Edgar Allan Poe's Monsieur Auguste Dupin, who had been in 3 stories earlier in the century. And he took Émile Gaboriau's character, Monsieur Lecoq, who was in France, and several novels that Arthur had read. And then he sat down and he started letting these things combine in his mind and mix up with his passion for reading the local news, the London news. And the papers at the time covered crime stories in great detail. So he had a sense of texture from that. And one of the things he had always enjoyed in writing was atmosphere and mood and texture, and he loved action and dialogue. He was not going to be Proust. He was going from the first to be a very fast-moving, observant, quirky kind of writer. And A Study in Scarlet, the first book, is not the very best of the Holmes adventures, but it's magnificent in the way it introduces Dr. John Watson, who is himself a great creation, a sort of John Bull, ordinary Englishman who can be skeptical of Holmes before we are, even as readers. And I think that helps make it all feel more realistic and more makes us more drawn into it through Watson's point of view.
What was the state of the detective story prior to Sherlock Holmes?
When I edited an anthology of Victorian crime stories called The Dead Witness several years ago, Sherlock Holmes doesn't appear until the middle. And that sort of emphasizes how much crime fiction was thriving at the time. Not just stories of crime and revenge and all of those sorts of things, but actual detective stories. Charles Dickens had created a detective who became an important character in his novel Bleak House. Wilkie Collins had created a detective who was an important character in The Moonstone. And so there were a lot of people writing actual detective stories featuring quirky, eccentric detectives who were often skeptical of the official police. So there's plenty of that going on when Arthur Conan Doyle published A Study in Scarlet.
What was different about Sherlock Holmes and the detective stories that Conan Doyle created?
I think that's part of the magic of it, because you get into it and you think, now what is this that makes this so much fun? In part, he was simply a really good writer in that he would sketch a character quickly with telling detail. He had a wry sense of humor that sometimes things were happening in the story that were funny to the reader, and none of the characters even realized that. But Sherlock Holmes had a kind of three-dimensional air about him, even though he was heroic and larger than life, because Conan Doyle would show his foibles, his vanities. He was quite cocky about what a brilliant young man he was. And Watson conveyed all this from his point of view as someone invalided home from the war and looking for a roommate. And they wind up, to begin with, just two young men who are deciding to split the cost of a flat together. And so seeing those glimpses of everyday life helped draw us slowly into the story. And Sherlock Holmes then sort of walks off the page by doing all of these magical things in a well-grounded, textured, atmospheric sort of scene.
Does that make Sherlock Holmes a kind of revolutionary character in the history of detective fiction?
I think he was. He had a clear lineage behind him as a character, in the same way that Arthur Conan Doyle did as a writer. But he was revolutionary in that these other detective characters did not have his grounded, firm way of observing little details of life. And that's the part that Joseph Bell played as inspiration for Conan Doyle, in that Edgar Allan Poe could create these fanciful, macabre sorts of stories, but he didn't have any real experience of anyone behaving in this manner the way that Arthur Conan Doyle did. He had seen Joseph Bell be a brilliant detective in real life, and in day-to-day, day in, day out, through years of medical school. Young Arthur had watched him be a brilliant detective just in the medical field. And so Conan Doyle just took him outside that, and then you have a character who's intellectual and passionate, and Holmes becomes very much a voice of reason and a heroic trust in evidence. And so in that sense also he's a character of the time, because you couldn't have detective stories before you had a notion of respect for evidence over accusation, witnesses versus torture, all the many things that had evolved in a system that at least nodded toward some kind of fairness and justice.
Before you go, what is your favorite Sherlock Holmes story and why?
I think my favorite has to be Silver Blaze, the one about the missing racehorse. When I was invited to write a short story for an anthology, I wrote The Memoirs of Silver Blaze and retold the story from the horse's point of view. And that reminded me of all the many things I like about that brilliant story. And Conan Doyle himself bet his wife £1 that she could not guess the murderer in the course of reading the story. I think it has so much beautiful, what I call texture, and atmosphere, and the rain practically blows off the page. It's so convincing in its mood, and it's dramatic and exciting, and shows not the very best moments of Sherlock Holmes seeing every single thing with his laser gaze, but it shows him being quirkily, weirdly heroic.
Well, then perfect for the subject of the book. The book, again, is Arthur and Sherlock, Conan Doyle and the Creation of Holmes by Michael Sims. Michael, thank you again for being here.
Thank you. It was great fun.
This is Greg Coles, an editor at The Book Review. To talk about what we and other people are reading, I am joined by my colleagues and fellow editors Elida Becker, Gal Beckerman, and Jen Salai. Hi, Elida.
Good morning.
Gal, hi.
Hey.
And Jen.
Hi.
So briefly, what other people are reading. On the hardcover bestseller list this week, in fiction, it's all about beginnings and endings. Endings, we have Karen Marie Moning's final novel in her Fever series. It's a 9-book series. The last book is Fever Song, and that makes its debut on the hardcover fiction list at number 6. And beginnings, James Patterson starts a new series with the writer Candace Fox. This book is called Never Never. The series is the Harry Blue series, and that book debuts right at number 1. There are also a couple of new books on the nonfiction list. Jonathan Chait's Audacity, which is a look back at the legacy of Barack Obama, makes its debut on the list at number 12. And Michael Eric Dyson's Tears We Cannot Stop, which is subtitled A Sermon to White America, it makes its debut on the list at number 8. So that's what other people are reading. What are we reading? Jen, what do you have in front of you there?
So for the week before, I was working on something for the book review. So people will learn more about those books once the piece actually comes out. But right now, the last couple of days, I've been reading Joseph Roth's novel Right and Left. And it's
another Roth. There's Philip, there's Henry.
Many Roths.
David Lee.
Exactly. And this was actually something that we have had on our bookshelf at home probably for the past at least 10 years. And it's one of those books that I had been meaning to read. I had read Rebellion a number of years ago. And I've actually never read, I guess, his most famous book, which is the Radetzky March. Mm-hmm. This one, though, is one that we've had for a while. And I picked it up because it looked like something that, in terms of our current moment, it just seemed to have some resonance, maybe. It's about
Trump to thank.
It's about a family in Berlin. After the war, one of the sons comes back and he inherits his father's banking business. And so he sort of leads this very bourgeois, cosmopolitan life. And then the younger brother actually becomes involved with the brown shirts. And so it's about their relationship.
You say after the war, so this is after World War I.
After World War I, exactly. And so, I'm just getting to the part where it seems like things are falling apart in terms of inflation. And so the banker is now contemplating going into business with sort of a mysterious Russian emigre.
Do you know when this book was written?
Yeah, so apparently it was written in 1929, so a few years before the Radetzky March, but a number of years after his first novel, The Spider's Web, came out.
And so he's really writing this very much as it's taking
Yes.
place. It's not historical fiction.
Right,
Yeah.
right. He's in the thick of it. I think at the time he was also writing a lot of journalism. And so this book is very much informed by that. And it's sort of one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that, there's a lot of satire in this book. I mean, not necessarily particularly funny, but incredibly witty satire. Pointed, witty, but also at the same time you can tell, he, as a journalist, I think really, you can tell that he's interested in sort of trying to understand people's motivations. So even though it's pointed and witty, and there's a certain ruthlessness to it, it's never totally unempathetic, which I think is really an impressive feat for a book like this.
And Roth is credited with a lot of prescience about World War II, right?
Yes, yes.
Or about the rise of a certain kind of fascism.
Right.
Yeah.
And apparently, I mean, I haven't read The Spider's Web, which is his first novel, which was published in 1923, but I heard that there's actually a mention in that book in 1923 of Hitler by name.
Wow.
Which is...
So he had
he
his
was on it
finger-
early.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was kind of the spy magazine of
There you
1920s
go.
Germany.
You heard it here first.
Gal, you're also reading a book that's several decades old.
Yeah. So I read, last year I read Sarah Bakewell's At the Existentialist Cafe, which is kind of a biographical sketches of all the major existentialist thinkers of the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century, and it kind of reconnected me with my 20-year-old self. As many of us in our early 20s were infatuated with existentialism. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper into the ideas because it was interesting to think about them again as an adult. And so a book that came up in her book a lot and that I've heard other people mention, including some colleagues here, is William Barrett's Irrational Man, which was a survey kind of existentialism that came out in 1958 and is really credited with kind of introducing American audiences to existentialism as a serious philosophy, because up until then, I think it was kind of thought of as kind of a French cultural mode, like berets and, sitting in cafes and stuff. And so the book really traces the kind of roots of existentialist thinking, back through Christian thought, and all the way back to he's looking at the Greeks, and trying and really kind of tracing a distinction between thinking a kind of a rationalist thinking, one that found its full expression in the Enlightenment, and a thinking about man as man as kind of animal, as kind of an intuitive being in the world and individual, and that this tension kind of throughout philosophy that then the existentialists really kind of explore more fully.
It sounds from the title as if Barrett is arguing that the existentialists fall on the irrational side of things.
I mean, the notion is that existentialism explored a human being not as this purely rational creature, but as
animalistic or
exactly. And I think what was interesting about the existentialists and what could be relevant right now also is that they looked very much at kind of the individual and the individual's will, against kind of bigger societal forces, which is why I think that it's appealing to 20-year-olds when you're thinking about how to make your own life. But I think it was also very relevant for most of these thinkers, Sartre and others, who were writing at a moment where the world kind of seemed to be swirling mad around them. You could say that for moments of kind of resistance or it's particularly poignant, which is maybe why it's kind of coming into vogue a little bit again, with Bakewell's book.
Yeah, plus existentialism is always kind of in vogue under the current, under the surface there. Yeah. So another book with some topical reverberations. Elida, how about you? You reading anything topical?
No. In fact, I'm here to represent the escapist point of view. Because I read so many novels for my work, I often read nonfiction in my spare time. And what I've been reading two sort of domestic nonfiction books, one human, one avian. There's a wonderful woman named Ruth Goodman who does programs for the BBC. Which she goes back into a particular period and lives as if she were, say, a Victorian or an Elizabethan. And I've been reading her book, How to Be a Tudor.
That's Tudor with a D.
Tudor with a D. Tudor with a D. And you must not tell your children about this book because apparently in the Tudor period, I'm learning,
they didn't take baths, and they scrubbed themselves with linen cloths. And she did this, and she didn't smell. So your
like
children
the
should not be taking
non-shampoo
baths.
trend that's going
exactly.
Although microbiome.
Yeah,
there is.
Yeah, there is. Anyway, there's all kinds of fascinating stuff in here, and also the derivations of phrases that we don't think about, like when you tuck your children in, sleep tight. Where does that come from? It's from those strings that they have on their beds, because
to tighten the
mattress, which was made out of straw. And anyway,
how far does she go to really live?
She does this for quite an extended period of time, and they film it all. I haven't seen the film. I'm just reading the book.
So maybe not quite as far as A.J. Jacobs in the Year of Living Biblically.
No, but I'm sure she'll get around to it. So. Anyway, and the other thing I'm reading... Avian. It's called Into the Nest, Intimate Views of Courting, Parenting, and Family Lives of Familiar Birds by a woman named Laura Erickson. Mainly, this is just for self-preservation because in my house there is this determined cardinal outside my house who keeps banging against one of the windows, just one window, and he's banged against it so much that he's actually made a crack. And I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on, so I started looking at this book, which actually has a photo of a cardinal banging against a window.
What is going on?
What is going on is that it is mating time, and he sees he sees his reflection, and he thinks that it's a rival. And so we've had to put another use for masking tape and duct tape. We put duct tape all over the window
just to stop the reflection,
to keep him from seeing his reflection.
Wait, so your window is covered with duct tape?
My window is now covered with duct tape. Totally covered.
What a frustrated guy, because he keeps beating up the rival, and the rival keeps coming back.
Exactly, and the rival keeps thwarting him. So anyway, I'm about to read about other birds that will soon turn up back in the garden. The cardinals apparently don't always migrate, so this is why he's hanging out when everyone else is in Florida. So
when you first told this story in the office and said a cardinal was beating at your window, I didn't know you were talking about a bird. In my mind, I was
thinking about a Catholic cardinal.
Yes, well, my husband is a lapsed Catholic, but I don't think they would follow him that far. So anyway, so I hope to have something more serious for you on another date. So.
Please don't.
I don't know. I mean, it could be considered timely in some ways, too. Beating at the window. Yeah. And Greg, what are you reading?
Well, I mentioned last week that I was on the verge of starting Robert Caro's The Power Broker, which is his massive biography of Robert Moses. And true to my word, I bought that last weekend and I have started it. I'm not very far in it. Because of the size of this book, it's almost 1,300 pages. It came out in 1974, and when New York was a rough place, and I swear, he wrote it this big so it could stop bullets. I think it would take a bullet. I'm only maybe 20 pages into it so far. I'm not even through his introduction where he's kind of setting up everything that Robert Moses did in New York City and throughout New York State, the suburbs and going all the way up to kind of Niagara and beyond there. I can tell already that it's living up to its reputation, both in terms of its style rhetorically. He writes with this very kind of high-toned, old-fashioned sentences. And in terms of its ability to marry very specific small details and scenes to much bigger themes that he's capturing in Moses's life and the life of the culture at the time. So it's it's promising to be great, and I'll be talking about it for the next year and a half.
Yeah, we see where your bookmark is. It's very daunting.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.